Sometimes, it's better to resolve misunderstandings openly rather than letting frustrations build until they explode. This was the case for a man who, in a moment of irritation with his girlfriend, ended up throwing her into a grizzly bear enclosure. While such a situation might be alarming to any person, it was particularly dangerous given the notorious aggression of grizzlies. Join us as we explore the events that unfolded after this shocking incident. The wildlife sanctuary was supposed to be a peaceful escape for Jake and Mia, far from the chaos of city life. Surrounded by thick pine forests and the quiet hum of nature, it seemed perfect. Yet the calm of the wilderness did nothing to ease their tension. From the moment they arrived, Mia complained about the bugs, the cold, and the lack of cell service. A recent storm had worsened conditions, leaving muddy trails and downed power lines, further fueling her irritation. Jake, already on edge, found his patience dwindling. Hoping to ease the strain, Jake suggested a guided tour of the sanctuary. Their guide, Carl, seemed uninterested, sharing facts in a flat, detached tone as they walked through muddy paths. Mia continued grumbling quietly, her dissatisfaction growing with each step. When they reached the grizzly bear enclosure, the tension hit its peak. The massive bear, drenched from the rain, moved slowly within its fenced-off space. Carl droned on about the bear's size, but Jake was too distracted to care. Mia muttered something under her breath, snide and insignificant, but it was the final straw. The frustration, discomfort, and constant complaints had built up like pressure in a dam. Without thinking, his rage overwhelmed him, and before he could stop himself, he snapped. His hands shot out, shoving Mia hard toward the enclosure's fence. It was supposed to be a petty act of spite, a release of frustration. She would stumble, maybe cry out, but the barriers would hold, and she would be fine. But the moment his hands connected with her back, Jake realized his mistake. The storm had damaged the fence. Carl had mentioned it earlier, but in his anger, Jake hadn't processed it. The electrified fence that was supposed to be impenetrable had malfunctioned. When Mia hit the barrier, it gave way. She tumbled through the gap, landing in the muddy enclosure with a sickening thud. Time seemed to freeze. Mia lay motionless for a heartbeat, stunned by the fall. The bear, which had been ambling lazily in the far corner of the enclosure, lifted its massive head, its black eyes locking onto the new intruder. In that split second, the air was charged with a sense of impending doom. The bear began to move. Jake stood paralyzed, his mind racing as adrenaline flooded his veins. The enormity of what he had done crashed over him. It wasn't just a shove. It was a betrayal, an act of violence that had put Mia in mortal danger. The bear was advancing now, faster than its lumbering gait had suggested possible. Each step it took seemed to shake the earth beneath Jake's feet. Carl was shouting, but the words didn't register. The rest of the tour group had scattered, fleeing in terror as the situation spiraled out of control. No one was coming to help. It was just him, Mia, and the bear. The grizzly reached Mia before she could fully regain her footing. With a swipe of its enormous paw, it sent her sprawling again, her scream echoing in the enclosed space. Blood splattered the muddy ground, bright and stark against the brown earth. The bear stood over her, its breath heavy, its eyes filled with primal hunger. Jake's body moved before his mind could catch up. He scrambled towards the broken fence, slipping in the mud as he climbed into the enclosure. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear, guilt, and desperation. He had to do something, anything, to stop the bear from killing her. But what could he do? He was no match for the grizzly's raw power, and he knew it. Yet something in him couldn't stand by and watch her die. Not like this. Not because of him. The bear swiped at Mia again, catching her in the side. She screamed, and the sound cut through Jake like a knife. He grabbed the nearest object he could find, a fallen tree branch, and charged at the bear, swinging wildly. The branch struck the bear's flank, barely making a dent in the thick fur and muscle, but it was enough to draw its attention. For a brief, terrifying moment, Jake found himself face to face with the grizzly. The beast's eyes were wild, and its breath came in hot, ragged bursts. Time slowed as the bear considered him, sizing up this new threat. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The bear roared, a sound that shook Jake to his core. It lunged towards him, and Jake stumbled back, slipping in the mud, barely avoiding the deadly swipe of its claws. He could feel the weight of its presence, the raw power of its bulk bearing down on him. For a moment he thought this was it, that he would die here, in the mud, torn apart by the beast. But something unexpected happened. A blaring siren cut through the chaos, startling the bear. The sanctuary's emergency response system had finally kicked in. Red lights flashed along the perimeter of the enclosure, and the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance. The bear hesitated, its attention drawn to the noise. It gave one last warning growl before turning and lumbering back into the deeper part of the enclosure, retreating into the safety of the trees. Jake collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The aftermath was a blur. Mia was rushed to the hospital, her injuries severe but not life-threatening. The sanctuary staff were frantic, assessing the damage and securing the enclosure. Jake stood on the sidelines, numb, as the gravity of what he had done settled over him. He had nearly killed her. In a moment of anger, he had made a choice that could never be undone. As he watched the medics load Mia into the ambulance, guilt crushed him, heavier than the bear's presence had ever been. There would be no escaping the consequences of his actions now. Emily had always prided herself on being an experienced solo hiker. Over the years, she had conquered some of the most challenging trails across the country. When she heard about a newly opened national park, renowned for its untouched beauty and rugged terrain, she couldn't resist the lure. It was a place where few had ventured, and she relished the opportunity to explore the vast wilderness. Despite hearing warnings from the locals about recent aggressive bear sightings, Emily remained undeterred. After all, she had faced wildlife before and had the skills necessary to navigate through unpredictable situations. The morning she set off, the air was crisp, and the sky stretched out in a flawless blue arc overhead. Her backpack was packed with essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, and bear spray, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. Emily's path led her deeper into the forest, and as the hours passed, the trail grew more challenging. The dense underbrush tugged at her clothes, and the terrain became steeper and more uneven. But she was in her element, moving steadily, her body in tune with the rhythm of the wilderness around her. Occasionally she would stop to take in the view or consult her map, but mostly she pressed on, determined to reach the high ridge that promised panoramic views of the untouched wilderness. Midway through the afternoon, as she was navigating a particularly steep section of the trail, Emily noticed the first sign of trouble. The dense woods ahead seemed unnaturally still. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, had fallen silent. It wasn't long before she realized her mistake. As she descended into a small, shaded valley, she came across a thicket of bushes heavy with berries. Her attention was drawn to a movement just beyond the foliage, a large, dark shape moving slowly through the brush. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was a bear, and not just any bear. A mother bear with her two cubs trailing closely behind. Instinctively, Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew the danger of encountering a mother bear, especially one with cubs. They were notoriously protective, and even a perceived threat could trigger aggressive behavior. Slowly, she began to back away, hoping to put distance between herself and the bears without drawing their attention. But it was too late. The mother bear had already noticed her presence. She raised her massive head, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air, and let out a low, rumbling growl that made Emily's blood run cold. The bear's protective instincts had been triggered, and her calm demeanor quickly shifted to one of tension and readiness. Emily's heart pounded as she began to step back more quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray in her pack. But before she could fully retreat, the bear charged, her enormous frame thundering through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Emily knew she couldn't outrun a bear. No human could. Panic surged through her, but years of hiking experience kicked in, and she fought to stay calm. She turned and bolted, running as fast as she could, weaving between trees and dodging the uneven ground. Her mind raced as she tried to recall everything she knew about surviving a bear encounter. She knew running wasn't the right choice, but her instincts had taken over. She needed to find cover, a place to hide, or something to put between herself and the bear. The forest blurred around her as she sprinted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, she could hear the bear crashing through the woods, relentless in its pursuit. It wasn't just a chase, it was a battle for survival. Desperately, Emily scanned her surroundings. Up ahead, she spotted a large, fallen tree, its trunk thick and gnarled, with a hollow space underneath. Without hesitation, she dove toward it, crawling into the narrow space beneath the trunk, her body pressed tightly against the cold earth. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to control her breathing, hoping the bear would lose interest and move on. The sound of the bear's approach was deafening. Emily could hear the creature sniffing, growling, and pawing at the ground nearby. She clutched the bear spray in her trembling hands, ready to use it if the bear tried to reach her. The seconds dragged on like hours as she lay there, trapped between the earth and the massive tree above her. For what felt like an eternity, the bear circled the area, agitated and searching for its perceived threat. But after a few tense minutes, the bear seemed to lose interest, perhaps reassured that its cubs were no longer in danger. With one final huff, the bear lumbered off into the woods, her cubs following close behind. Emily remained under the fallen tree long after the sounds of the bear had faded. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not from the cold but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through her veins. Slowly, cautiously, she crawled out from her hiding place, her muscles stiff from the tension. She stood on shaky legs, scanning the forest to make sure the bears were truly gone. The silence of the forest returned, but it felt different now, less peaceful, more menacing. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had survived the encounter, but the wilderness had reminded her in the most visceral way of its raw power and unpredictability. There was no room for complacency out here. With the sun sinking lower in the sky, Emily knew she had to make her way back to the trailhead. She couldn't afford to linger, not with nightfall approaching. Every step she took felt heavier than before, the weight of the day's events pressing on her. She had ventured into this wilderness seeking solitude and challenge, but what she had found was something far more profound, a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving reality. As she made her way back, Emily knew she would never forget the chase or the feeling of being so utterly vulnerable. It was a lesson she would carry with her, one that would shape her future adventures. Survival in the wilderness demanded respect, not just for the land, but for the creatures that called it home. The vast, untamed wilderness of Alaska stretched out before the group of tourists, an imposing yet breathtaking landscape. Snow-capped mountains lined the horizon, towering over dense forests and glacial rivers that whispered of the wild secrets within. The tourists had arrived with high hopes, eager to witness the famed brown bears of Alaska in their natural habitat. Armed with binoculars, cameras, and an adventurous spirit, they were ready for an experience they would recount for years. However, no one anticipated just how unforgettable the day would become. The group consisted of 10 tourists from various corners of the globe. Among them were John and Sarah from the US, Marlene from Germany, Takashi and his wife, Yuki from Japan, a Brazilian couple named Rafael and Sofia, and several others from Italy and Australia. They were a diverse mix, drawn together by their love of adventure and wildlife. Some, like John, were seasoned travelers accustomed to navigating rugged landscapes. Others, like Yuki, were novices, wide-eyed with excitement and a hint of trepidation as they stepped into Alaska's raw, unfiltered wilderness. Leading them was Rick, a local guide with years of experience under his belt. Rugged and confident, Rick was well known for getting his clients close to the action, sometimes a little closer than was advisable. He had a laid-back attitude that reassured the group, making them feel as though they were in the hands of a true expert. Despite warnings from park rangers about recent bear activity, Rick was unfazed. He had encountered bears before and always managed to keep his tourists safe, or so he liked to believe. The group had spent the morning hiking through dense underbrush and crossing icy rivers, occasionally stopping at lookout points where Rick pointed out animal tracks and described the habits of the local wildlife. The excitement was palpable as they followed the trail of a large male bear that had been seen in the area recently. According to Rick, it was one of the largest bears in the region, and the anticipation among the tourists grew with each step. By early afternoon, they reached a broad clearing near the riverbank, an ideal spot for spotting bears fishing for salmon. The tourists positioned themselves at a safe distance, their cameras ready to capture the moment. But Rick wasn't satisfied. His ambition to provide an unforgettable experience drove him to lead the group closer to the river, toward the water's edge. Though some of the more cautious tourists exchanged uneasy glances, Rick's calm demeanor and experience made them trust his judgment. The river murmured beside them as the group inched forward, the surrounding forest unusually still. Then, emerging from the dense trees on the far side of the river, a massive brown bear appeared. Gasps rippled through the group. The bear was enormous, its hulking frame covered in thick, glistening fur. It moved with a quiet grace, oblivious to the onlookers as it approached the river to fish. The tourists began snapping pictures, hearts racing with a mixture of awe and excitement. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The bear, indifferent to their presence, focused on the river, searching for its next meal. Rick, buoyed by the success of the sighting, led the group even closer, gesturing for them to stay quiet and still. He believed they were safe, so long as they didn't provoke the animal. But nature is unpredictable, and Rick's confidence is about to be shattered. Without warning, the atmosphere changed. The wind shifted, carrying the tourists' scent toward the bear. Or perhaps it was the crack of a branch underfoot. Whatever the trigger, the bear's head snapped up, its dark eyes locking onto the group. A shiver of dread passed through the tourists as they realized the bear was no longer ignoring them. Its posture stiffened, muscles tensing as it stood taller, staring directly at the humans now too close to its territory. In an instant, the bear charged. Panic erupted. The tourists scattered, running in all directions, their previous excitement replaced by sheer terror. Sarah, who had been standing near the front of the group, froze in shock. John grabbed her hand and pulled her away, but chaos reigned. Shouts of fear filled the air, mingling with the thunderous sound of the bear barreling toward them. Rick, whose overconfidence had led them into danger, was frozen in place, paralyzed by the enormity of the mistake he had made. The bear closed the distance with terrifying speed. Its sheer size was overwhelming, the ground trembling beneath its paws. Takashi, trying to lead Yuki to safety, stumbled. He fell hard, and in a heartbeat, the bear's attention shifted. The massive creature swiped at Takashi with its powerful paw, sending him sprawling as Yuki screamed in horror. The scene unfolded with brutal clarity, the bear's primal instincts taking over as the humans it once ignored became threats. As the tourists scrambled to find safety, Rick finally snapped into action. His hand shook as he fumbled with the canister of bear spray. He aimed and sprayed a cloud of the noxious substance toward the bear, hoping to drive it back. The bear paused, shaking its head, momentarily blinded by the spray. But the reprieve was brief. The bear roared in frustration, its senses overwhelmed, and turned away just long enough for the remaining tourists to flee deeper into the woods. Those who managed to escape dashed into the forest, fear propelling them through the thick brush. Sophia and Raphael ran together, their feet barely touching the ground as they pushed further away from the river. Marlene, struggling to keep pace, tripped over a fallen log, bruising her knees, but fear kept her moving. When the bear finally retreated, the group had scattered across the wilderness, some hiding in trees or underbrush, others lost in the disorienting maze of the forest. Hours passed before the survivors regrouped, shaken and exhausted, but thankful to be alive. They called out for the missing, Takashi, Yuki, and Rick, but received no answer. Later, a search party found signs of the attack, blood on the riverbank, torn clothing, and scattered belongings. The bear had vanished back into the wilderness, leaving behind a scene of devastation and loss. In the days that followed, the survivors tended to their wounds, both physical and emotional. What had begun as an adventure had turned into a nightmare. The beauty of Alaska's wild landscape had revealed its dark, unforgiving side, reminding them all of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's raw power. The Arctic stretched vast and unforgiving as a team of scientists established a camp on the tundra. Their mission was to study the effects of climate change on polar bear populations, hoping to understand how these apex predators were adapting to shrinking sea ice and dwindling prey. Their camp, a cluster of reinforced tents and equipment, lay miles from any settlement. In this isolated wilderness, only the wind and the creak of ice underfoot broke the silence, a constant reminder of the harsh environment. Weeks into the expedition, the data painted a grim picture. Polar bears, struggling with reduced hunting grounds, were venturing closer to human camps, scavenging for food, a desperate behavior never documented before. The team had placed bait equipped with sensors far from camp to monitor bear movements and kept their perimeter secure with tall fences and motion-activated lights. Despite their precautions, the Arctic's unforgiving nature loomed large. The landscape's stark beauty masked its indifference to human presence, and survival was always at the forefront of the scientists' minds. They pressed on, driven by their research, unaware of the looming danger. One evening, temperatures plummeted as a storm gathered on the horizon. Dark clouds signaled the arrival of something fierce. The scientists scrambled to secure their camp, ensuring equipment and fuel reserves were in place. By dusk, a howling gale enveloped the camp, snow falling in blinding sheets. The storm raged with terrifying intensity, shaking the tents and cutting off communication with the outside world. Trapped, the scientists huddled together, enduring the brutal cold as the storm threatened to rip apart their shelter. As the night wore on, an unsettling unease grew. Polar bears had been sighted near the camp just days before, scavenging for food in their desperation. At the height of the storm, a faint guttural growl pierced the wind. It was unmistakable. A polar bear was nearby. The growl grew louder, followed by a sharp crack. The bear had breached the fence. At that moment, the fragile boundary between human presence and nature's raw power collapsed, leaving the team to face the Arctic's genuine unpredictability. The camp's floodlights flickered on, illuminating the swirling snow just long enough for the team to catch a glimpse of the massive creature. Its white fur was almost invisible against the storm, but its sheer size and the ferocity in its movements were unmistakable. The polar bear, driven by hunger and desperation, had torn through the perimeter and was now inside the camp. There was no time to react, no chance to run. The bear moved with terrifying speed, its powerful limbs propelling it through the snow, heading straight for the tents. The scientists scrambled, their minds racing as they tried to assess their options. They had trained for this. They knew the protocol for bear encounters, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of facing an apex predator in the middle of a blizzard. Their only chance was to make it to the bear-proof shelter at the edge of the camp, a small, reinforced building designed for emergencies like this. But the storm made visibility nearly zero, and the bear was already too close. Panic set in as the creature tore through the first tent, its claws slicing through the fabric with ease. The team members who were inside barely managed to escape, their movements clumsy in the deep snow. The bear, ravenous and relentless, followed them, its breath visible in the freezing air, its eyes locked on its prey. They had seen polar bears before and studied their behavior from afar, but this was something different. The bear was exhibiting aggression, unlike anything they had documented. It wasn't just hungry, it was desperate. The scientists fought to stay ahead of the bear, slipping and stumbling as they tried to make their way toward the shelter. But the storm made every step a struggle, the wind pushing them back as the snow blinded them. Behind them, the bear roared a sound that cut through the storm and sent chills down their spines. One by one, they reached the shelter, slamming the heavy door shut just as the bear reached the entrance. For hours, they huddled inside, listening as the bear clawed at the walls, the sound of its frustration mingling with the storm. The scientists, shaken and exhausted, could do nothing but wait. Eventually, the storm began to die down, and with it, the bear's attacks grew less frequent. But the damage had been done. When the storm finally passed and the bear moved on, the team emerged from the shelter to survey the wreckage. The camp was in ruins. The perimeter fence was destroyed, and several tents were shredded. They found traces of the bear's path, the deep tracks leading away from the camp and disappearing into the endless white. It was then that they realized the true significance of what had happened. The behavior they had witnessed wasn't just an anomaly. It was a sign of something far more troubling. The polar bears, once rulers of the Arctic, were changing. The desperation they had observed in the animals before was only the beginning. This attack, so vicious and unprovoked, suggested a shift in the predator's behavior, a response to the changing ecosystem that the scientists hadn't anticipated. In the aftermath, the team documented everything they could: measurements, observations, and data points. They had survived the encounter, but the implications of what they had uncovered would linger long after they returned to civilization. The polar bears, like the Arctic itself, were on the brink of transformation, and what that meant for the future of both was a question that no one could yet answer. The morning after a severe avalanche, the mountain stood quiet and indifferent, its snowy crown glistening in the faint dawn light. For a group of climbers stranded near its peak, however, the silence was a constant reminder of the dangers that still surrounded them. They had been a party of 8 seasoned mountaineers with years of experience scaling the world's most formidable peaks. Now, after the avalanche's crushing force had swept down the slope, there were only 5 left, huddled in makeshift shelters carved into the snow, their bodies shivering from cold and exhaustion. The avalanche had come without warning, a sudden roar of breaking snow and ice that swallowed everything in its path. Those who survived had done so by sheer luck, finding pockets of air or managing to scramble behind rocks just as the wall of snow hit. When the chaos settled, the damage was apparent. Their climbing gear was buried deep under layers of ice. 2 members were missing entirely, and one lay still with a shattered leg, his breath shallow and uneven. The radio, miraculously intact, was their only link to the outside world. It had taken hours, but their frantic calls for help had reached the nearest base camp, which relayed the message to the mountain's emergency response unit. By the time the rescue team was dispatched, the storm was already gathering strength again, and the path to the climbers was treacherous, twisting narrow routes with cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into icy ravines. But there was no time to waste. The stranded climbers were in a race against the elements, their bodies deteriorating with each passing hour. The rescue team, led by an experienced mountaineer named Harris, knew the risks all too well. Each step was calculated, with every team member roped to the other, using ice axes and crampons to secure their footing on the ever-slipping terrain. The sharp and relentless wind whipped through the valleys, carrying with it the sting of snow that obscured their vision. They moved in single file, their bodies hunched against the wind, knowing that a single misstep could send them tumbling into the abyss below. Despite the dire circumstances, the rescue team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on them. The radio crackled intermittently, bringing faint updates from the climbers above. The storm was closing in, and temperatures were plummeting. They needed to reach the climbers soon, or it would be too late. As they neared the location of the stranded group, the landscape became even more perilous. The snow underfoot was loose and prone to shifting, and the jagged rocks that protruded from the ice created natural obstacles. Yet it wasn't just the terrain they had to contend with. The mountain was home to wild animals, and with winter tightening its grip, those animals were growing increasingly desperate for food. Hours into the climb, the radio fell silent. Harris frowned. The battery couldn't have died yet, and the climbers had promised to keep in contact. Still, they had no choice but to continue, hoping that the climbers were holding on. The wind howled louder as they approached the ridge where the survivors had been last reported. Harris led the way, peering through the swirling snow. And then, there they were, 5 figures crouched in the snow, their eyes wide and hollow, their bodies wrapped tightly in whatever layers they had managed to salvage. Relief washed over Harris, but only for a moment. As the rescue team reached the climbers, the radio came back to life with a garbled warning. The words barely registered before a low, guttural sound echoed through the wind. Harris froze, his senses suddenly on high alert. He turned, scanning the landscape, and there, not more than 30 meters away, was the unmistakable form of a grizzly bear. It was massive, its thick fur matted with snow, its powerful body heaving as it lumbered toward them. The bear had likely been disturbed by the avalanche and was now defending its territory. It moved slowly at first, sniffing the air, but its intent was clear. It saw the climbers and the rescuers, and it was not pleased by their presence. Panic rippled through the group, but Harris quickly raised a hand, signaling them to stay calm. Any sudden movements could provoke the bear further. They had to think and act strategically, or they would all be at the mercy of this beast. The team split into two groups, one to tend to the climbers and the injured, the other to face the bear and attempt to ward it off. Harris knew that bears were territorial, but not typically aggressive unless threatened. But in these conditions, with food scarce and the bear on edge, they couldn't rely on typical behavior. They waved their arms, shouting and clapping, trying to appear as large and threatening as possible. The bear stopped, its dark eyes locked on them, its massive paws sinking into the snow as it tested the boundaries of its space. The air was thick with tension, the roar of the wind now drowned out by the heavy breathing of the animal and the muffled cries of the injured climbers behind them. Minutes passed in a standoff, the bear pacing back and forth, unwilling to leave but not yet fully committed to an attack. The rescuers held their ground, standing between the climbers and the bear, knowing that any wrong move could mean disaster. Every muscle in their bodies was taut, every breath measured. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity, as they waited to see what the bear would do. Then, without warning, the bear let out a roar and charged. Harris and his team reacted instinctively, scattering to draw the bear away from the climbers. They used their ice axes to strike the snow, kicking up a cloud of powder to obscure the bear's vision. The animal hesitated, confused by the sudden flurry, but it pressed forward, driven by instinct. One of the rescuers stumbled, his footing lost on the unstable ground, and the bear turned its attention to him. Harris rushed forward, waving his arms and shouting to distract it, while the others grabbed the fallen climber and dragged him to safety. For a moment, it seemed as though the bear might press its attack, but then, just as suddenly as it had charged, it stopped. The bear stood there, its great body heaving, its eyes darting between the rescuers and the climbers. It was tired, perhaps confused, and after what felt like an eternity, it turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the swirling snow. For several long minutes, no one moved. Then, as the adrenaline began to fade, the rescue team sprang back into action. The injured climber was stabilized, the others were secured with ropes, and the group began their long, slow descent down the mountain. The storm raged around them, but the threat of the bear had passed. Yet, as they made their way down, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that they had come far too close to losing everything that day. Not just to the mountain, but to the wilderness itself, which remained as wild and untamed as ever. The scent of autumn filled the air as leaves swirled across the paths of a bustling urban park. On weekends, the park was alive with the sounds of children playing, dogs barking, and the hum of the city. It offered a brief escape from urban life, a patch of nature nestled between towering skyscrapers. Yet the city's relentless expansion crept closer each year, fraying the delicate balance between the wild and urban worlds. That day began like any other. Families picnicked, joggers circled the lake, and teenagers played soccer in an open field. Near a grove of trees, a small family, 2 parents and their young daughter, unfolded a picnic blanket, laughing as they laid out their lunch. But something stirred beyond the tree line. The forest, once a haven for wildlife, had been pushed back by the city's growth. Food for the animals that once roamed freely had become scarce. A black bear, driven by hunger and displaced from its natural habitat, ventured dangerously close to the park. In the days before the attack, the bear had been drawn to the city's outskirts, scavenging in dumpsters for scraps. But food was limited, and its hunger only grew. The scent of human food, carried by the wind, led the bear further into the city. Desperation overcame its instincts, pulling it into the heart of the urban park in search of sustenance. As families enjoyed their peaceful day, the bear, pushed to its limits by hunger, closed in, unaware of the chaos its presence would soon unleash. The delicate line between civilization and the wild was about to be shattered. For park authorities, this was not entirely unexpected. In recent years, there have been sporadic reports of wildlife creeping into the city: foxes, deer, and even the occasional coyote. But a bear was different. It was more significant, more dangerous, and far less predictable. Rangers had been briefed on the possibility of an encounter, though few believed it would actually happen. After all, the park was crowded with people. Bears tended to avoid human activity, preferring the solitude of the woods. On this particular morning, though, as the bear crossed into the park's boundaries, it did not care about the crowds. Hunger outweighed the fear. It sniffed the air, catching the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread. The aroma drew it closer, and it moved with purpose, lumbering toward the family picnic like a shadow creeping across the landscape. The first to notice was a jogger who had taken a moment to catch his breath near the edge of the woods. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. There, among the trees, a large, dark shape moved slowly but deliberately. His heart raced, not from the run, but from a deep, primal fear. He backed away, glancing over his shoulder at the unaware picnickers and the families dotting the grass. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to dial the park's emergency line. The bear emerged from the trees. At first, it moved cautiously, its massive paws almost silent on the grass. The family didn't notice immediately. The father had just opened a soda can, the hiss of carbonation masking the sound of the approaching threat. It wasn't until the mother stood up to reach for a napkin that she saw the bear, no more than 30 feet away, staring directly at them. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her hand trembling as she slowly reached for her daughter, who was busy building a small tower out of sandwich crusts. Panic spread quickly. The mother's eyes widened, and she gestured frantically to her husband, who was still oblivious to the danger. When he turned and saw the bear, his reaction was immediate. A surge of adrenaline propelled him forward, scooping up his daughter and pulling his wife toward the nearest pathway. But the bear, sensing movement, took a few steps forward, its massive head swaying from side to side as it gauged the situation. Around the park, people began to notice. There was a ripple of confusion at first. Parents called out to their children, unsure of what was happening. But when the bear let out a low, guttural growl, the atmosphere shifted. Panic turned to full-blown chaos. People grabbed their belongings and ran in all directions. A few, frozen in disbelief, stood rooted to the spot, their eyes locked on the hulking figure, now advancing toward the heart of the park. The bear moved faster now, driven by hunger and the growing energy of the terrified crowd. It was confused but determined, its instincts pulling it deeper into the chaos. A cyclist, trying to flee, lost his balance and crashed into a park bench, sending a wave of fear through those around him. Screams echoed as parents desperately called for their children. The noise only agitated the bear further, and in its confusion, it reared up on its hind legs, towering above the crowd. Park authorities had been monitoring the situation from the moment the first call came in. Rangers, equipped with tranquilizer guns, rushed toward the scene, but the park was vast and the bear moved quickly. They had trained for this, rehearsed how to handle wildlife encounters, but theory and reality were two very different things. By the time they reached the clearing where the bear now stood, the scene was one of pure pandemonium. The family who had initially caught the bear's attention had managed to escape to safety, but the bear, still disoriented, was surrounded by fleeing people. The rangers moved in cautiously, keeping their distance. They knew one wrong move could provoke a deadly reaction. The bear let out another deep growl, its eyes wild with confusion, hunger, and fear. The first tranquilizer dart hit the bear in the shoulder. It let out a startled roar, spinning around to face the rangers, but it was already too late. A second dart followed, and then a third. Slowly, the bear's movements became sluggish. It swayed on its feet, its massive body struggling to stay upright. Within minutes, it collapsed onto the grass, breathing heavily but no longer a threat. As the panic subsided and people began to gather at a safe distance, the rangers moved in to assess the situation. The bear, now unconscious, was loaded onto a truck to be relocated back to the wild. But for those who had witnessed the attack, the image of the creature, so out of place in the middle of their city park, was seared into their minds.